Welcome back to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here again with my friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Padgett, to talk more about my recent discussion on the podcast. This discussion was with Dr. Brendan Case, a guy who I've not read before, but I stumbled across a really fascinating essay of his called Pascalian Mockery as Love of Enemy. And this really piqued my interest, Tim, because for a long time, I've sort of wondered about the relationship between mockery and satire and ridicule on the one hand, and then Christian love on the other hand. What does it mean for Christians to be loving and winsome when it seems biblically like certain sharper tools are available to us within righteousness? And so I really wanted to understand the relationship between these two things. Does it just mean being nice? What does winsomeness mean? What does it mean for your speech to be always with grace, seasoned with salt, and so forth, and yet still be able to tell your opponents, as Paul himself did, to emasculate themselves as a sort of rhetorical gesture? So Brendan helped me through a great deal of that. His article itself is tremendously helpful, and I understand that you have written a little bit about the subject in the past. So first of all, welcome back to Upstream. It's great to have you. And I'm excited to talk more about this subject.
Sure. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on again. Both you and I share a love of witticisms and things like that. And it can be, there are those moments where our natural inclination is to take out that rapier wit and, apply it, judiciously. But then we do see those passages where there's, gentleness of speech and things like that, and love and self-control and all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be hard. But then again, you look at all the passages, you look at Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and he's making scatological humor.
Right.
Is the Baal off in the bathroom? Is he talking a little louder? And just openly sarcastic, openly satirical. And those things can be a little hard to reconcile. I guess I really enjoyed the conversation you had. Very fascinating conversation. And also, perhaps it has something to do with me living in a Christian world bubble. That I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, which is kind of a Christian mecca, and then I lived in Wheaton, Illinois for a while, which of course is almost the one, and then now I live in Colorado Springs. So maybe that says I need to get out more. But it was encouraging to hear this guy who's at Harvard, who's in Boston, and he's doing all these great stuff. It was really encouraging to hear that.
It was encouraging, and I particularly appreciated the very solid guidelines that he offers. It really Pascal offers, and we'll get into that because the controversy that kicked this off is a fascinating historical moment. But I really appreciated the fact that it was so clear. It's actually a 6-item list that he sort of puts together of criteria for when and how to use mockery as a tool, to use making fun of your opponents, and how it's not a mode you switch into when you decide to stop loving an opponent or an enemy. It's actually a way of loving an enemy. And that was a super distinction for me. But first, let's talk about this because your specialty is history, right? I want to talk about this set of circumstances that led up to the writing of the provincial letters and Pascal sort of defending mockery as a tool. So as I understand it, you've got these two parties within Catholicism. You've got the Jansenists who are, I read them and I can't really distinguish them from Calvinists because they're very predestinarian, right? Hardcore Augustinian predestinarian. And then you've got the Jesuits who are the opposite of all those things and are also known for being very politically agile, shall we say, and for being able to multiply distinctions to their own sort of advantage. Some would say that the Jesuit tradition strays into sophistry from time to time. But so you got these two competing factions. The Jesuits have much more power between the two of them. Help us understand what happens next, because I'd never read this story before.
Sure. I mean, it is a very fascinating period. You're coming in the 17th century in France. You're coming out of the Reformation era. It's no longer the tumultuous times of the 16th century, the 1500s with Luther and Calvin and so on. Things are fairly stable. But within France, France in the 16th and 17th centuries was not exactly stable all the time. They had come out of a period of civil wars over religious issues. They've finally, to some extent, come to some peace, but it does show that it was not a monolithic peace. We tend to look at the past and we think there's Roman Catholic is one group and Protestant is another group. Well, here, just in that essay that Case is cited here, he talks about 3 different groups, all French Roman Catholics. and they're all within, engaging with one another. And you're right. You read the Jansenist stuff, and it sounds like just take that one little more step, one more step, and you'll be a good Calvinist like you and I are, right?
Right.
They had a great appreciation for Augustine. And that's another one of those moments where I think it was B.B. Warfield who said that the Reformation was a battle between Augustine's followers on grace and Augustine's followers on the church. The Roman Catholics took his views on the church, and the Protestants took his views on grace. It just shows that it was not a simplistic thing. But I think the key thing that gets to this era is that the Jesuits, as you said, they're very sneaky, very sharp. I mean, from the early 1500s, 1521, I think was when they got going. They always appealed to very sharp guys. You couldn't just be a random guy and join up. You had to be highly intelligent. And they did stray into, as you said, sophistry or casuistry. Like they were asked, like when the English finally made the move solidly over to Protestantism, they could be arrested. And if a Jesuit was asked, "Are you a priest?" they could say, "No, I'm not a priest." In his mind, thinking, "I'm not a Buddhist priest." So they kind of played with words and things like that. Very lawyerly kind of stuff. But they managed in significant areas across Europe, because they were highly educated, because they were highly motivated, they managed to secure themselves positions of influence, either through educating the sons of the nobility and therefore gaining a foothold to the next generation, or just gaining the ear of the more powerful. There's a long history of how they got in there and why it was appealing. It could be appealing in the particular debates between the more Augustinian-leaning Jansenists and where the Jesuits advocated was that with the Augustinians having this dour was the word that Case used, and that's fair sometimes. The more dour view of human nature means a distrust, whereas the Jesuits had a higher view of human nature in many ways, which meant that certain people might be able to act rightly. You could trust them, hence the king. So it was very powerful for the monarchies, the idea that they could rise above ordinary failings of ordinary people. And so they got to this moment where they have this power. And I think that plays a role here because the Jansenists and Pascal and many of these other guys, they're on the outside. They're dissenters. And you've got the other overtly Protestant ones like the Huguenots and Camisards and people like that are also engaging in this. And they're finding a way to kind of beginnings of free speech sorts of things. So as in y'all's conversation, you get to the point where the Jesuits are the powerful, and they're also not really willing or needing to listen to anyone else. And so Pascal here takes up the sword of his wit, and a guy who basically dies at 39, but he still invents whole branches of mathematics. If he could do that, he could probably do some razor wit as well. So it is a very fascinating period. Yeah,
I mean, he's a brilliant figure. He's taking up, in this case, for his friend Antoine Arnauld. I think it's Arnauld. Maybe the D is silent. I'm not a French speaker.
French pronunciations, they just ignore letters. They just pronounce randomly.
Just ignore a third of the letters, and you're pretty safely going to be pronouncing it in the French way. Yeah. So he's taken up for his friend here. He writes these provincial letters. It's sort of I compared it to Luke writing to Most Excellent Theophilus, where it's just sort of this imaginary recipient who he says, here's what's going on in the provinces and so forth. And then he proceeds to lampoon his opponents. But there's this one, I think it's the 11th letter that Brendan really focuses in on. And this is the one where he backs up for a second and he actually does a reflective defense of his use of satire, because the Jesuits were coming back at him and the other Jansenists and saying, well, look, you can't mock us. You can't mock these theological claims we're making because you are impugning or rather you're profaning holy things. You are treating as common what is holy here. And that is blasphemous. It's irreverent, even if you don't agree with us. And he comes back with this very sophisticated defense of the use of satire. And so I want to walk through these criteria here and see what your thoughts are on them. And I think it's just good to review them for the sake of our listeners. The first criterion is that charity speaks only truths. It can't lie. Lie is out of bounds as a rhetorical strategy. So that's, one thing that should go without saying, but oftentimes in the satirical world and the world of mockery, you can edge into lying about your opponents.
Yeah. I mean, I think that shows how this is such a difficult task is because satire almost always I mean, I know that in y'all's conversation, you talked about the value of using direct quotes. And I think that's really good because it shows that not only does it show that you're not being dishonest, but it also, you're turning their words against them. They can't complain. They don't really have a defense against their own words. But there is an element sometimes where hyperbole and exaggeration and
go ahead and cut it all off.
Yes, exactly. So Paul is not actually telling them to emasculate themselves. However, he's pushing them to do that. He's saying, if you're going to do this, here's the implication. And I think there is a place sometimes for hyperbole done carefully. So it's one of those moments where it must speak truth. And I think that has to be a moment where you say, I'm not going to attribute to someone motives that they don't claim. When you do hyperbole, you also have to say, this is an exaggeration. You have to be clear about it. I mean, you think about things like, the Babylon Bee and stuff like that, how they were often exaggerate. I saw when I was looking up some of these things today, I saw there was someone was complaining about the Babylon Bee thing because the Babylon Bee had said that feelings are now a sufficient answer for math problems. And of course, that's not true. But theoretically, you should know that's not true. But what do you know happened? People took it as being true, that there was a legitimate comment being made. And so that just shows the hardness of it. There has to be a place for hyperbole and to tease not tease someone, but to tease someone's ideas out to their implications. But you still have to keep it on there a little bit to keep it zeroed in on what they actually have said. So that just shows the hard line of it.
You have to be extremely distinctive, extremely obvious with your sort of exaggeration. So when Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, it's funny. It's a funny and outrageous image. It's meant to, you could imagine someone in his audience sort of snickered at that, just picturing it. And that's the sort of hyperbole that draws out the ridiculous aspect of what he's mocking. And the same thing, Pascal does the same thing where he draws out the ridiculous aspect of these Jesuit claims. Like, for instance, the idea that if you're sort of ignorant of or you sin in ignorance, then you're not guilty of the sin, right? So you can be forgiven that. And he takes it out to its logical conclusion and goes, it's best if we don't tell anybody anything about Christian morality then, because they'll be all the more innocent then. In fact, the best of all is to be like someone off far away from the reach of the gospel out in the wilderness who knows nothing, because that person is completely innocent. And then he hails this opponent who has come up with this ridiculous idea as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, quoting John the Baptist.
That's a great example of teasing out to the absurd point. But the sad thing is people do get to those absurd points sometimes. It shows that what satire and sarcasm can do is they can skewer our perception of like a simple answer. So often I think we want a simple answer. And someone could say, if you only pay attention to one side of the equation, you're going to miss something. And that's where satire can come in, because it can say, you're only paying attention to part of this. You need to see the complexity of the situation.
So the second criterion is that charity does not speak every truth, but only what discretion permits. And when you unpack this, what he means is that you should be attacking the ideas and not the people for the most part. Now, Brendan sort of qualifies that, and he said there are times when the moral character of the person is going to be at issue, and you see that when you're attacking, for instance, immorality by a public official, as John the Baptist did with Herod. But the basic idea here seems to be that if you're arguing over a point of theology, you should make it about that point of theology, not the people. So you can mock these ideas. And Brendan brought up the example of, if you're talking about a matter of family law, for example, or a matter pertaining to family morality and structure, you should mock the ridiculousness of the ideas being put forward. Don't bring that person's family into it. Don't mock them. So, I would say, for instance, if you're talking about the modern marriage debates, right, or the modern gender debates or something, I think there's absolutely a place for mocking some of the more absurd claims made. I think that you can do that in a very stealthy way too, like Matt Walsh does in the What is a Woman documentary, where he doesn't even make the joke. The joke is made for him because it's his facial expression as people try to explain this nonsense. He doesn't put up a picture of this particular gay activist or trans activist's family and go, haha, let's laugh at that. Look how ridiculous these people are. It's not, there is a love, there is an expectation that these people are redeemable. These ideas, they're irredeemable. They're nonsense, but these people are redeemable. And that's a distinction that I know several people at the Colson Center have made before. In fact, we have kind of a little unwritten rule. Maybe it is written somewhere. I just forgotten where. It's, we're ruthless with ideas and gentle with people. And that Pascalian rule of not speaking every truth or doing so with discretion seems to parallel that nicely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I thought his distinction about there are times where calling out the person can be appropriate. You think of the stereotype of a conservative politician who's all about family values on his platform, but he's around with prostitutes or what have you. Or the left-wing politician who's all about tax the rich and shows up at the Met Gala with this $10,000 dress or something like that.
It's funny to talk, to mock Al Gore for flying around the globe in a private jet using enormous amounts of fossil fuel while he tells people to stop using fossil fuels. That's funny.
Yeah. And I think that there is, even with other debates, there's challenging people on the to extend out the logic of their positions, that they say X, they say that, a marriage can be between whoever you want it to be, that it's all about what's your heart, love is love. And then you see the nut picking, as we call it, you can say that there's not a logical distinction between the argument for marriage between whoever you want to be and marriage to a dog or marriage to a ghost. You see these stories every once in a while. Yeah, making that link is a way that you can take the one example and link it so that, again, that can be a form of love, to say you don't have a barrier, you don't have a guardrail between what you're saying about marriage and what you live your life with these other people that we all say are off the bounds. But yeah, I think there has to be an importance of that in whether it's the whole attacking the idea but not the person thing. It really is helpful. Even almost self-centeredly, it's helpful because it puts people on the defensive, because you realize if you do it right, they don't feel attacked. And that causes them to have a gap between them. If you insist on having a gap between the person you're talking to and the ideas they're holding, that can encourage them to have a gap and to question it. And I think that's particularly hard in our age, because any sort of dissent is considered an attack. Any sort of disagreement is considered disrespect. There was an instance just yesterday with Congressman Hawley was talking to this Berkeley law professor, and he was asking questions about, who can have babies and whatnot. And he made a very innocuous comment, and the person who was replying said, "Well, I want to note that your comment is transphobic." All he was doing was asking questions, and that's a hard thing when someone's personality, their identity, and their ideas are wrapped up together. It's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, that's actually a great point for a detour here that I wanted to take as we talk through these rules, and that was distinguishing someone's taking offense at what you've said to you actually having given offense. And so there will be a lot of people who will use this sort of claim that you've offended me, you've hurt me, you've attacked me as a shield or a way to deflect things. And I think, Christians who are bound to speak with charity and with love are sometimes vulnerable to hearing that and immediately stopping the attack, even if it's like a legitimate attack on a legitimate evil. There can be those crocodile tears, and as soon as we see them, we have to back off, and we have to be very careful with that. And I want to tease out exactly how we avoid that, especially within the context of this debate. It sort of forms the background of my discussion with Brendan and why I wanted to have him on. You know what I'm talking about, where there's this back and forth in the Christian sort of academic blogosphere and ministry blogosphere. There's this debate about winsomeness. Is it still good to be winsome with the secular world, to be gracious and loving in our speech, or can we, kind of break the knives out? Can we get a little more aggressive with them? Is it time? Are we living in I think it was Aaron Wren who came up with the, positive world, neutral world, negative world. Are we really living in negative world now? And is there no recourse except bringing out the sharper rhetoric?
Yeah, absolutely. It is tempting to think that is the only recourse. Again, we live in a world where people's identities and ideas are conflated in their own minds. I think that there's a lot behind that, because since we have rejected as a culture the idea that there is any overarching meta-narrative, that there's any truth that's bigger than any of us. The only judgment we can make has to do with feelings, because you can't attack feelings because feelings are feelings. You can't say that feelings aren't true because feelings are neither true nor false. So offense becomes the core of core identity. And you have this vicarious offense where person X will say something, and then person Y will come along and say, that's offensive to person Z. Person Z doesn't even have to say anything, right? But person Y can claim this was offensive. And so then, the first person has to come along and apologize, not for actually offending anyone or having said anything that was untrue, but because they said something that potentially could have been offensive.
I love those scenarios where it's like, you're in a college campus and you see this all the time where it's like, as a white woman, I am offended on behalf of the Polynesian islanders whose culture you just appropriated, who are not here.
I mean, the irony of the white person to the rescue for the poor non-white people. There is a great irony in that. When we're confronted with moments like that, just the sheer irrationality of the age, it can be tempting just to come guns blazing. And you see this Flight 93 mentality, where it's such an emergency situation. Not only is there the irrationality of the world's philosophy, but there's the intensity of the progressive agenda having gained control of the universities, gained control of the media, et cetera, et cetera. And if we don't come out fighting, then everything's going to be lost. That's not a crazy thought because, well, you know what? There is a lot of, progressive groupthink and lots of institutions across the land. So it's not crazy to think that. I would say it's foolhardy. I'm not going to call people fools, but I'm going to say it's foolhardy to say that the only solution now is always to fight. Sometimes it is right to fight. And that's the problem, is it sometimes. And that's something that I call them the winsomeness people and the warriors people. And they've in that debate that you see, again, they're looking for a simple answer. The right answer is always to be winsome. The right answer is always to fight. Well, life's not that simple. Sometimes having the rapier wit is a really helpful way of dealing with the culture issues, as you, in case, talked about, that it's to not necessarily to convince the person who's the object of the wit, but the people around them. The satire sometimes gives permission to people like the greengrocer guys, the people that you guys talked about in that conversation about the bystanders who aren't necessarily going to stick their own heads up. It gives them permission to ask questions. It's not just winsomeness. It's not just warriorsness. It's wisdom, and wisdom is hard.
You should make sure to like trademark that or copyright it or something. That
Nice.
was really good. One of the points that was so interesting, and I really, I thought this was key to the discussion, is what you just said, that everyone sort of agrees that we should be winsome, and that everyone agrees we should stand by our principles, but we can't agree on exactly when and how to apply these tools or when to break them out. That was, and he contrasts a few different writers. David French's name came up, Aaron Renn's name came up. There are a few others. It seems like all these Christian communicators agree that, number one, we have a duty to love our enemies, right? They've all very clearly affirmed that we must love our enemies. That command is not conditional. It's not bound in a certain time. It's for all time. That is what Jesus said, and that's what we must do. But then they also all agree that that doesn't preclude very forceful, spirited engagement with false ideas, that we should really fight. We shouldn't give up. We shouldn't lay down. We shouldn't be doormats. And even someone is convinced of the duty to winsomeness and as prolific in writing about it as David French has openly said that, we should fight with all we've got. We shouldn't, give up. And so both sides affirm this, and yet they seem to have some sort of disagreement about the mode of engagement when it comes down to it. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly where the disagreement is, because it's almost like a tonal issue or a prudential issue. It doesn't seem to work along hard and fast lines.
Image I've used in conversations about this is that it's like the church or the world is in a boat. We're in a rowboat in a lake, and there's holes in it. One's on the right side, one's on the left side. And if you're looking at the one on the right side, you say, this needs to be fixed. And you might be right. And then if you're looking at the one on the left side, you're just like, this needs to be fixed. And you might be right. And the problem is there's holes on both sides. The problem is there's water coming in. And it can be very easy to fixate on one problem. And I think that comes out of our experience. I think a lot of these people who are on the winsome side of the debate, they're people who grew up in a lot of, evangelical culture, and they saw occasionally some mean-spirited attitudes. sometimes genuinely mean-spirited attitudes among the religious right. Or you even get it up into the whole Trump situation, where they see things where there's obnoxiousness, and they rightly object to that. But then they also perhaps go too far, and they see any sort of conflict with the world as being bad. Anything that sees a challenge with the culture as being a negative thing we should avoid. And then conversely, I think a lot of people who grew up in a little bit more winsome mentalities, they feel betrayed. They see that all the winsomeness in the world didn't win the world's favor. They see that and say that we can't simply cave and cave. It becomes almost this appeasement sort of thing. Appeasement will only get you more aggression. And their reaction is not only to reject, again, the legitimate examples of appeasement, but pretty much any time there's any sort of winsomeness. And so they're recognizing legitimate problems and then extending that a little further. Again, it's a matter of focus. What you see as a perhaps legitimate problem, you're excluding other problems that might be. And I think it's also we tend to overcompensate for where we have come from. If we've come from a world where antagonism was the rule of the day, and you see that does not win any converts, well, you can kind of turn against any sort of antagonism. And then conversely, if you're been in a more the gentle world, you can see those as a consistent issue, and you must oppose that wherever it shows up.
So Pascal's third and fourth criteria here for when to use mockery really go together well. The third is that charity mocks only what is evil, that satire and mockery are really sort of lamentable results of the sinful condition of the world, of the fall. He says that we use these as tools to attack or render less credible prevailing evils or pressing evils, things that need to be dealt with in our world. But we never use it to attack what's good. We never use it to sort of tear down God's good world or to tear down God's good people. And that goes back to that, that earlier principle. And then, of course, it flows right into this fourth, which is that Pascalian mockery always desires the salvation or wills the good, as Brendan puts it, of those that it mocks. And so it doesn't wish to see their destruction. It wishes to see their redemption from bad ideas or bad practices or the ridiculousness into which they have fallen. And that seems like the fundamental orientation of the whole thing to me, is that willing of the good, the desire that this person would give up their folly, would come out of the pig slop, and would embrace wisdom instead. It's a very Proverbs-like attitude. Answering the fool according to his folly, which is just another way of saying what satire and mockery are, is for the sake of the fool. That in order that you could win him potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. That proverb, one of my favorite things about Proverbs is those two lines right together. Answer a fool according to his folly. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. And they're both right there. And it shows that this is not easy. And I think that shows also the emphasis on satire, sarcasm, wit being used for the good, some of the problems of our age. As I think you guys in your conversation mentioned, how often do rhetorical things on socio-political issues come tell, did you see so-and-so destroyed, annihilated?
With facts and logic.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And both sides use it. And I think it shows a bit of the problem that the goal there is to destroy. There's two problems there. One, there's no love. You're not loving your neighbor. You're not caring whether that person converts or anything, changes their mind. You're not even attempting to engage them. The other problem is it's irrespective of the truth. It's not saying you defeated them by reason. You showed them that they were wrong or showed others that they were wrong. The focus is on destruction. Victory for the sake of victory. Just power. Just a reduction to power. They were brave. They were challenging. All that kind of stuff. And what is a great praise to a politician these days? Well, he fights. She fights for us. And that's the only focus of it. It is. I think we need to see the wits and sarcasm. It's got to be a scalpel to get the tumor, not simply to destroy the enemy. It is so very hard to do this in a way that is appealing to the other side. You can see it done. I love watching like the British Parliament, their Prime Minister's Questions Times. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out, where the leader of the government has to go before the whole Parliament and take any question. And those guys are hilarious. and they skewer each other left and right, and everybody laughs. I mean, there's that famous thing about Margaret Thatcher talking about socialism, and she's talking about all this kind of stuff. And what's great is the person she's attacking laughs at the joke. And it's great. And you see that. And there's a beauty in that.
My esteemed colleague would rather that the poor become poorer than that the rich become richer. Everyone starts laughing. He just sort of, I forget who it was, but he just sort of like nods. He's like, you got me. You got me.
Or you think of the Reagan-Mondale debate in 1984, when it sounds like Reagan's about to be defensive and he completely turns it on Mondale. And even Mondale starts laughing. It's great. So you can see these things. And we love, there's the Luther insult generator. We love that. And we love Churchill's wit. And we love Mark Twain and all these sorts of things. But where are we now? We're at, The Daily Show, which there's no attempt to engage. There's no attempt to do anything constructive. And that just shows the problem. You look at Blackadder and Monty Python, those great British, humor things, and it's harsh humor, but there's a smartness to it. There's an attempt that you can laugh at it and laugh at yourself. And I think that that's a sad thing, is that we as a culture have lost. So it makes it hard to do this, hard to do it well.
There's a moment speaking of Parliament, there's a moment in the Amazing Grace movie. So I don't know if this is exactly a precise historical exchange, but I think it probably characterizes well the style of engagement in Parliament going back, generations, and probably Wilberforce's own style, where there's, the debates about the slave trade are happening. He's presenting his annual bill to abolish the slave trade. And one of the other MPs gets up and he's like reading this long, boring list of all the obscure economic impacts that'll happen in some island colony somewhere if they get rid of slavery. He's like, in the fish that this one industry, the fishing industry off of, this part of England can't use in food. They're not fit for English consumption. Well, they ship those off to the slaves, and they would lose that business if it weren't for slavery. And Wilberforce stands up and he goes, if my esteemed colleague continues to scrape the bottom of the barrel, he's in danger of getting splinters under his fingernails. And, everyone laughs because they recognize, oh, yeah, this is pretty ridiculous. When we're talking about weighty moral issues, and here we're talking about fish guts and how important it is to preserve that economic. He lampooned him effectively, and I think lovingly, in the name of an extremely important cause. And he goes into this next set of double implied criteria. And I like what he said about it being implied in Pascal's writing, that he never explicitly says this, but there are two additional things that must be true in order for satire to be morally acceptable. The first is that mockery is only to be used in conditions of conflict with those who are both powerful. And then the second is unreasonable. So you can't punch down. You got to punch up. This is a way to get the attention of, or to draw attention to, equal the attention of someone who's more powerful or equally powerful to you. You shouldn't be using this as a method of bullying. And then secondly, your opponent has to be unreasonable. In a certain sense, they have to be beyond the reach of normal goodwill conversation. You've tried that and it's not working. Well, it's time to break out the mockery, the satire, because even if that doesn't shame them, as Pascal said, into reconsidering their views as ridiculous, it will get the attention of bystanders. It will prompt them to realize, oh, this is ridiculous and I shouldn't believe it.
Yeah, I think that satire can give permission to the bystanders to question what the powerful are saying. That is one of the key things it does, because rarely, as you and Case noted, no one likes to be the object of wit. Even those, like we're talking about, Mondale or the British Parliament, even the guys who laugh at the joke and recognize that was funny, they don't enjoy it. Nobody enjoys that, and it's not often going to change your mind. But it can give permission. And I think that's something that's important. It can give permission for you to see. Well, I think one of you mentioned the emperor has no clothes. To call attention to that fact is a great virtue that satire can have. But again, as you say, you can't punch down. You can't find somebody who's simply a fool, someone who simply doesn't know what they're talking about, someone who is in a weak position for all sorts of things. There shouldn't be that place of belittling that person. To clarify, to things like that, there has to be, you can critique those ideas, but you have to be so careful that John the Baptist uses satire and sarcasm about Herod. He doesn't use it about prostitutes. There's a difference there. And that even though each of them is sinful, he uses very different methods. Again, it goes back to the wisdom thing.
Well, that's absolutely true. If you look at the New Testament at the way satire and mockery are deployed, as far as I can remember, it is consistently against the powerful or against the intractable, the ones who are, or the recalcitrant, I should say, the ones who just will not listen to anything else, and the puffed up, the arrogant.
Yeah, Jesus is perfectly comfortable to have dinner with Pharisees. We tend to think, Pharisees, enemy, bad. Jesus had dinner with tax collectors. We talk about that. He also had dinner with the Pharisees. But when the Pharisees were being silly and the Sadducees were being silly, he was snarky. All these sorts of things. He could be challenging. But when people were listening, he would talk to them. It's not that that there's good guys and bad guys. It's much more complicated than that. And Jesus used, wisdom again.
So, Tim, where does this land us here as we wrap up this discussion? I think I have a lot more clarity on the question of when, where, and how to deploy the tools the tools of mockery and satire, the things that will make people laugh and blush, the ones that sting a little bit, like the Babylon Bee. But I'm not sure that I entirely know where to draw the line. I don't know if I can look at a particular instance and say, that Babylon Bee headline, was okay. That one was not okay. Or that political cartoon was okay. That one was not okay. What's your sense on that?
Well, the easy step. No, I'm just kidding. There is no easy step. I mean, that's the problem. A couple of guidelines I have in my mind. In one of the columns I wrote about this a few years ago, and one of the things is, if you can't take the joke, then don't make the joke. And that has to be part of it. If you're going to dish it out, you need to also have that perspective. You need to have the perspective of being willing to hear it come back at you. You shouldn't skewer someone if you're not willing to hear the sharp critique back, the humorous critique back. And then the other one is the one you mentioned before about the fact that what are you attacking? Are you attacking an idea? Or are you attacking a person? An idea does not become bad because the person is bad. A person can become bad because of their ideas in that sense. But be sure to put it that way, that you are attacking the idea of something. And then finally, are you doing this for good? Well, as the discussion you guys had about the fun little Greek words, about what love really is, seeking the other's good. And I love that discussion, talking about how so many people avoid the idea that there can possibly even be an enemy. Well, the Bible talks about you loving your enemies, which kind of means it's easy to love someone who's not your enemy. It's the hard thing here is this is your enemy. How do you love your enemy with a rapier wit? And that's hard, but it means challenging them, but doing so in a good humor, in a way that recognizes the dignity of the other person. And again, striving for that thing that the Brits do so well with their questions time, that they can be in on the joke too. Your goal is to get them to laugh at it as well, to see their own folly. And I think that keeping some of those things in mind, there isn't an easy answer, but kind of some guidelines. I think that it's a trajectory we can aim for.
Here's a parting observation that I thought was kind of interesting. You and I have both seen Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Speaking of, British humor, and there's a lot in there that's just, pure gold. Even the stuff that we would say probably crosses the line into blasphemy or sacrilege. You have to check yourself because they present they're masters at being funny. But there's one bit in there that has become extraordinarily relevant in our time. And of course, it's when Stan decides that he wants to become a woman because he wants to be Loretta because he wants to have babies, right?
Yeah.
And the funny part about this to me is back in the 70s when this was done, that would probably qualify as punching down because nobody in the UK at that time looked at, transvestites or the beginnings of the thing we call transgenderism and would have said, oh, they're powerful. That's punching up. No, those were considered very, very confused and sad people. And here Monty Python is mocking it. Well, fast forward to 2022, that bit becomes punching up. That is now a punch at the powerful, a very funny punch at the powerful. And, it's pretty much unacceptable now. You can't talk about that. You can't highlight it, but it becomes all the more valuable now. And so that to me, really illustrates well what Brendan's saying here, that this kind of skewering is extremely useful and extremely important for shaking people out of a moral stupor or moral deception about the world. but it must be done in order to address powerful and entrenched foolishness, not, to grind someone into the dust. And effective humor can do either one. It's very powerful as a tool. That's why it's so difficult to determine when to use it, because it is such a powerful tool, because it's such a big gun. You can win a war with it, or you can kill innocents with it. It totally depends on how you use it.
I mean, that goes back to the analogy you used about Augustine's just war, about how that war is a dangerous thing. It can be a defender of God's shalom. It can also be an oppression. And that's where the problem goes.
Well, Tim, thanks again for joining me to talk more about my discussion with Brendan Case. This was helpful, I think, illuminating in a lot of ways. And I want to talk more about this in the future, but this was a great jumping off point for me. And so I thank you for coming back to unpack some of the further dimensions.
Well, thank you again for having me. It was a lot of fun to have these sorts of conversations.